Hello, everyone. I'm Brian O'Leary. I'm the Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, along with BookNet Canada, led by Noah Genner, and Book Industry Communication, led by Karina Urquhart. We co-founded the Green Book Alliance in 2020. Green Book Alliance is organized to both develop and share information about best practices related to sustainability in book publishing. Today, we're doing a webinar specifically targeted as an introduction to your carbon footprint in book publishing. And we're fortunate to have two folks who have unique perspectives on this topic. The first is Liam Conway, who is currently Vice President Advisory Services and Chief Operating Officer with Carbon Zero, a Canadian-based organization that does a variety of things related to greenhouse gas emission inventories and the design and delivery of sustainability employee engagement programs. The second is Courtney Ward Hunting. Courtney is Senior Sustainability Production Manager with PRH UK. She has several years of experience working in sustainability and human rights within the supply chain, and she's going to share her perspective on some of the things that PRH UK has been able to put in place and some of the lessons that it might offer for other publishers, both large and small, across the supply chain. Today, we're going to start with Liam, who's going to kind of give us an introduction to Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Liam, if I can hand the podium over to you, and thank you for kicking us off.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian, and the Alliance overall for inviting myself and Courtney to present today. Obviously greenhouse gas emissions disclosure and corporate carbon footprinting, if you go on LinkedIn or pretty much any news page today, you're seeing more and more of this. It doesn't necessarily matter which industry you're in or what type of business or organization you work in. More and more, this is coming to light, that this is coming for your business, and that it's going to be something that your group may want to consider reporting on in the future. In terms of my presentation today, I'm happy to share a little bit about our group, just so you know who's speaking to you today. But really the focus of my presentation is going to be around the universe that's been created where GHG measurement and disclosures is really being accelerated today. Talk a little bit about how and why you're hearing more about this from all of the different industry programs that are being launched. But from there, we'll really get into the GHG inventory basics and talk a little bit about how to complete a greenhouse gas inventory, what are Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and try to maybe address some of the misconceptions around Scope 3 so that we can try to look at Scope 3 as a more approachable and achievable task. Because of course, when we hear Scope 3, we hear a lot of vague terms. It's not particularly as well defined as Scope 1 and 2. So we'll try to work through some of that. And I know that Courtney also is planning to speak to some more practical elements related to Scope 3 as well in her presentation. So just very quickly, Carbon Zero, as Brian mentioned, we're a Canadian-based greenhouse gas emissions management consulting firm. We're what you'd refer to as an integrated provider, in that we complete advisory services consulting projects. That's greenhouse gas inventories, carbon footprints, GHG reduction strategy, but we're also involved in the market-based aspects related to carbon offsetting, renewable energy sourcing, that come together to, you've probably heard about carbon neutrality or net zero commitments. Those two areas of our business are really frankly a focus for the vast majority of our clients. We've been around for about 16 years now. We were founded in 2006. We've got about 120 clients across Canada, the US, and Europe. And really our focus area for the next number of years is to continue to support our clients to measure, reduce emissions, and to build confidence and trust in the voluntary carbon markets to ensure that we're seeing carbon financing dollars going towards verified emissions reduction projects around the world. But in terms of this universe of programs that you're seeing and reasons for emissions disclosure that you're reading about, there's really a few key ones that we've seen evolve and become introduced in the last number of years. Just profiling a few of them here. But you may look at your company and say, well, we're not traded in the United States. The SEC climate disclosure program doesn't affect us, or we're not interested today in setting a science-based target, which essentially commits you to have your emissions over about a 10-year period. But what we're seeing is that there's this universe of programs being created, that it may not be you that's really going after one of these programs or reporting alongside one of these programs, but in the next number of years, it's very likely that one of your key customers, key vendors, partners may ask you to. So we're slowly starting to see the evolution of all of these programs really coming together to create this more holistic universe of carbon reporting and carbon disclosure. And I think all of these things working together is really why we're starting to hear more and more about this. But the good news is that if you're looking at a GHG reporting program, or you're considering disclosing your company, your organization's emissions, most of these programs still refer back to one leading GHG reporting standard, and that is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So the protocol is what brought out terms like Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. We'll get into what those actually mean in just a minute here. But the good news here is that we're all speaking the same language. When we're talking about setting a science-based target, you're going to, in all likelihood, use a Greenhouse Gas Protocol compliant inventory, which is something that organizations can do themselves. It's of course something that there's no shortage of service providers in the market today who can help you build a GHG protocol compliant report. But no matter what you're doing on emissions reporting, it's very likely that you're going to run into the GHG protocol. And frankly, as far as technical standards go, and we read a lot of these things, the GHG protocol is despite being about 10 years old, it's a well-written, it's easy to understand when you go through. Admittedly, it's quite long, but if you take the time to go through some of the key chapters, there's lots of great information that you'll learn in the context of your inventory. But perhaps one of the main things, and as Brian mentioned off the top, we're really trying to gain a handle on carbon footprinting and emission scopes. And the Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 categorization is really instrumental to climate reporting within the GHG protocol. And when we think of Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, you've probably seen some iteration of this diagram somewhere. Scope 1 is really talking about emissions that are coming from sources that you own or control. Scope 2 is all about purchased energy, and we'll get into this a little bit more in just a few slides. And Scope 3 forms this rather vague category of being everything else. And it's oftentimes where organizations really get crossed up. So in just a few slides, we'll try to address some of those misconceptions and address some of those details there as well. But just to go to the very basics, when we talk about doing an inventory, no matter really what you're looking at, whether it's Scope 1 fuel use in a fleet vehicle, or whether it's Scope 2 electricity use at one of your buildings, we're employing what's called an emission factor based approach to emissions calculations. And what that is really reliant on is having two key pieces of data, and that is activity data and its emission factors. So activity data really is just describing the amount or rate of an activity that's occurring over the course of a calendar or fiscal period. Generally speaking, when we talk about inventories and carbon footprints, we're reporting on a 1-year period. So in this example, we're looking at electricity at a facility, which of course is going to generate emissions based on the electricity grid that's relevant to that site. So in this particular example, we've used an approximate factor that's similar to what is seen in the province of Ontario, which generates about 25 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So in terms of an emission factor, you can think of that as an amount of emissions per unit of activity data. And for many things, you know, emission factors won't change that much. I mean, gasoline is gasoline, diesel is diesel. But when we get into things like electricity, where in Canada, for example, we have some of the dirtiest grids in the world, and we also have some of the cleanest grids in the world, it's really important to make sure that your emission factor is well sourced. And there's all sorts of sources that contain some of this important data that I'm happy to walk through at the end in Q&A. But this calculation is really what forms the basis of what we're doing in emissions calculations to arrive at that ton of CO2 equivalent at the end. And again, when we're talking about the scopes, you know, there's, you know, different definitions, you know, different ways to present this information. But, you know, scope 1, we're talking about assets that you own or control. And really what we're trying to focus on here within scope 1 is that the emissions are physically being generated from that asset that you own or control. So if you have an owned fleet vehicle, if you have a building that you own or have an operational lease over that produces emissions from a natural gas boiler or furnace, for example, those emissions are being generated at the asset level. Compared to something like scope 2, where when you turn on the light bulb or power up your workstation for the day, the emissions associated with that energy is not being generated from the laptop or from the light bulb. It's being, you know, generated by the power network that's producing the electricity. And the reason we account for this in a different scope is because we're classifying that emission source as an import to the boundary of the organization. So it's indirect. It's not being generated by an asset that you actually own or control. And again, scope 3, a lot of confusion does occur here, but, you know, it's always important to remember that there is a finite list to scope 3. It's one of the misconceptions related to scope 3. Oftentimes we hear, again, value chain, supply chain, these different terms that you know mean something to everyone, but they're not necessarily specific enough. But when we look at scope 3 to you know really zero in on it, the scope 3 reporting standard under the GHG protocol does actually have 15 unique categories, which admittedly is a lot. You know, you look at 15 categories and you scratch your head and you say, well, what do I report on? How do I know if I'm required to do this? But the good news is that the vast majority of businesses and organizations do not have to report on all 15 categories. The scope 3 standard is intended to capture material and relevant emission sources associated with some of these categories. So we hear from clients and groups all the time that they have no idea what to pick. They have no idea what's relevant. But to determine what you're obligated to report on, there's really two key checks that have to occur. One is a very simple yes/no assessment of whether a category is applicable. And it may be as simple as looking at a scope 3 standard and looking at, upstream leased assets or distribution and saying, we don't have any leased assets, we don't have any distribution, we don't have any, franchises, for example, or we don't travel in the air for business travel. And that's the clear-cut, easiest way to say, no, we do not have to report on that category. And the other is an assessment of materiality. And materiality is a word that you'll run into quite a bit when you look at scope 3 emissions reporting. It's generally not formally defined by the GHG protocol, and that the protocol does not say, if a category is X% of your total footprint, you must report. But usually what groups tend to use is that if any individual category is contributing, maybe about 5% to the total corporate inventory, it would likely be considered material. So that does require a little bit of, investigation and digging into things like how much do we travel, how much do we ship, what are the estimated emissions associated with that. But really, these two key decisions and these two processes are what will determine what your scope 3 boundary is, which again creates a much more manageable task when we look at what actually needs to be done on the scope 3 reporting categories to create what would be referred to as the overall operational boundary of your greenhouse gas inventory. And the operational boundary of your inventory is really capturing the emissions generating activities that you want to include in your inventory, both this year and in years to come, so that you can start to measure reductions and start to plan ahead in the form of setting, science-based targets or any GHG reduction target. But the operational boundary is basically what is going to be that data checklist, where every year you're going to go out internally and externally and try to retrieve the activity data that you need for each one of these categories, as well as link up the relevant emission factors that are going to help tell the story of what the inventory total is. So now, just in terms of what I was really trying to walk through here, this slide may be a little bit repetitive here, but again, what I always encourage organizations to do when you're looking at scope 3 is to take away the ambiguity. You're going to start with having a conversation with your leadership team or with your sustainability team, and it's going to naturally be quite vague and quite broad. One of the first things that you should do is go through those 15 categories, perform that relevance and materiality assessment, because what you'll find is not all categories are going to be applicable or relevant to your group. And in turn, that's really going to create a much more manageable task, likely one that you can do in-house, or at least getting started in-house, before potentially looking to a service provider to help validate or affirm your findings. And something that we run into with clients a lot is struggling with this notion of data collection. It's probably 80 to 90% of the groups that we work with. One of the first questions that they ask is, well, what data do we have to provide? And as far as scope 1 and 2, we often see that most of the data that we require for a scope 1 and 2 inventory, which is largely going to consist of your buildings and your vehicles, already exists in some shape, way, or form. You're either going to be able to get your natural gas, your electricity, propane bills from your various utility providers, your fleet fuel cards, potentially gas or diesel expenses. It's important to remember that there's really a couple of different ways to quantify your inventory from this type of data. It might be based on spend, but it might also be based on liters and gallons of fuel. And just because you don't actually have someone documenting how many liters they're purchasing at the pump doesn't mean you can't turn that spend data into a liters data. So oftentimes, if you have a line item in your financial records that says we spent $10,000 on fuel, we can work backwards and figure out, where was that fuel purchased? What was the rate per liter across the reporting period that we're looking at, to come up with data that is, reasonably easy to produce, but also much more accurate than if you were to just produce a much more generic estimate. And predictably, on scope 3, data collection is a little bit more challenging. I'm not going to get too much into this because I know Courtney is focusing on scope 3 in her presentation, but it really does involve a little bit of a broader team, both internally and externally, depending on which categories you're reporting on. Key customers and key suppliers are going to be really, really important to this. You might have suppliers that can provide you with material specific emission factors for things you buy, like paper or other materials. And it's very rare that organizations complete a scope 3 inventory and have 100% coverage. So often what they'll do is they'll go after their most important suppliers. That might be based on spend, it might be based on influence. But what we can do is we can look at, what is the carbon footprint of 80% of the paper that we buy, and then assume that 80% is going to be reasonably representative of the balance, so that instead of going through hundreds and hundreds of suppliers, you can look at the big ones, achieve that 80-20 balance and form an extrapolation without compromising data quality as well. So the data collection aspect is very much something that folks get stuck with. But it's often there's often more that you already have. So just getting started is often going to be quite illuminating for your group. And just quickly, this is something that I always try to share with groups when they're looking at completing a scope 3 inventory. Again, to take away the ambiguity, I've posted the link, and these slides will be circulated afterwards here. But when you start to look at scope 3s and you've established what you think you have to report on, or what you're choosing to report on, take a look at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol scope 3 appendices. They're all at the bottom of the website that's just linked below. Really what these do is they take out each individual category. So there's 15 unique individual documents that focus explicitly on what you're going to need to complete reporting on that scope 3 category. So a simple example would be for business travel. You're going to need your origin and destination pairs if you're looking at air travel, what flight class you were flying in, what actually represents good data quality versus poor data quality. There's lots of great examples here that will provide you, free accessible guidance to help you get started. And it's just really a sanity check to make sure that you're on the right track. But these documents are something that we always point out. So if you're starting on a scope 3 path, just be sure to take a look at these. Again, 5, 10, 15 pagers, very digestible and palatable. And of course, once you wrap up your inventory, and when you take an approach where you're using activity data and emission factors that are specific to your organization, specific to your suppliers, the fun part in this project is that it really becomes fairly straightforward to create a roadmap for future reductions by simply looking at your software or your spreadsheet and adjusting how much electricity you use after an energy retrofit, or adjusting for how much grid electricity you purchase after you account for things like renewable energy credits, or any kind of reduction in activity data can then be associated with a value for what that reduction will be in the future. So when we work with clients, that's really, one of the key things that we look at is what needs to happen within the business, within that scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 boundary for a group to achieve a 20, 30, 45% GHG reduction. But again, the approach, the activity data, the emission factor approach, if you're doing that internally, this exercise becomes relatively straightforward to look at this yourself. So there's no shortage of options in terms of what you may consider. That said, as you consider inventory completion, as you consider looking at scope 1 and 2 or scope 1, 2, and 3, we always tell groups that the more you measure, the more opportunity will be in front of you. So if you're committed to just, getting an inventory out the door and a supplier or a customer is asking you for information, you can start with scope 1 and 2 for sure, but that just means that your emissions reductions are going to be limited to things that you can do within your building and within your vehicle fleet, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You depending on your group, you may not have a massive scope 3 implication, but generally speaking, you do. So, a little bit of balance there. Don't be afraid to start big. GHG inventories are always something that iterate and evolve over coming years. It's never something that just happens once and they're perfect from the start. They're always something that needs work and grow in scope. So as far as a recap, that's maybe one of my key points here, but don't hesitate to just get started. There's lots of data under your organization's roof that's going to be instrumental in getting started on this project. So that's all I had today. I'm happy to turn it over to you, Brian, for a quick intro over to Courtney. I think we're doing questions at the end, I believe. So happy to stay on until then.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the introduction to the topic as in broad strokes, the way that you've given it to us. We're fortunate, as I said, to have Courtney Ward-Hunting. She's here today from PRH UK. Her role there is to help the company think through its sustainability profile. So she has some real world examples relative to book publishing that will bring to life, I think, some of the principles that Liam's had a chance to introduce us. Courtney, thank you for making the time, in your case this afternoon, to talk with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So hi everyone, my name is Courtney. I'm the Senior Sustainability Production Manager for Penguin Random House UK. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our journey to zero, what that means, and what our approach is to understanding and reducing our carbon impact. A little bit about us. So we have over 50 independent imprints across 9 publishing houses, and we are one of the largest, if not the largest, UK publisher. Our mission as a whole is to ignite a universal passion for reading by creating books for everyone. We are owned by Bertelsmann, who's a German media company, and we work closely with our sister group companies across the world. And for many years, sustainability has been a priority of ours, and it's been something we've tried to do with producing our books with sustainability in mind. And I've just got a few examples of some of the books and some of the authors that we've worked with over the last few years. So we've got the climate book from Greta Thunberg, we've got Extinction Rebellion, and we have our own witness profile books with David Attenborough. We also do lots of children's titles. So we have books on climate emergency, how to save your planet, and we do things like greener investing as well. So we've been really trying to not just focus on our operational environmental impact, but also as a publisher, it's really important for us to think about the content that we're producing and how we kind of advocate for that as well within our consumers. So quickly, our approach to sustainability. So in 2020, we began accelerating our emissions, and we created our first company-wide sustainability policy. They focus on 3 key areas. So the first is our journey to zero. So becoming climate neutral in our global value chain by 2030 and maintain climate neutrality in our direct operations. And I'll talk to that a bit more in a bit. But essentially, we've joined the Science Based Target Initiative. So we need a 50% reduction by 2030 and then able to offset the rest of the 50%. And we're looking to then look for maybe net zero in 2040 or 2050. We haven't quite decided that yet. The second is design for the future. So ensure 100% of our products and paper and core materials are ethically and sustainably sourced. So that kind of goes beyond carbon emissions and accounting for that, but we do think it's important to think about the life cycle of your books. So not just how they're made and the carbon impact it has, but also once it does reach to that customer, are they able to potentially re-gift it, repurpose it, or recycle it? And that's really what we're looking to do, is make sure that the materials, so not just the paper, but the inks and the glues and foils, etc., whatever we put on the books will be not negatively impacting the planet. And then lastly, as I mentioned, content. So using the power of our brand, our books, and our authors to really amplify the climate emergency and create positive behaviour change. I'll be talking mostly about carbon emissions and mostly scope 3, but I wanted to quickly touch on our carbon impact areas, and very close to what Liam was saying. The way that we measure it is really through the greenhouse gas protocol. For us, we've kind of linked scopes 1 and 2 together, and we kind of put them in our direct carbon footprint of what we can control and influence within our company. So that's the energy used in our head offices and our sites and our warehouses, our company vehicles, heating, power, etc., everything that kind of falls under that. And for the last several years, we've been really reducing that. So we switched to renewable energy across all of our sites. We've got or installed over 1,000 solar panels in our warehouse. We've reduced our plastic packaging by 67%. And we are looking to embed ISO 14001 environmental management standard across all of our sites by the end of this year. So we were kind of on a mission to really reduce that, and we feel like we're now at that place since 2020 where we could offset the remainder of those emissions. So we're doing that through our partner, who is called Climate Partner, based in the UK and Europe, and they've been really helping us to put that into carbon credits into forestation in Brazil. So scope 3, our indirect carbon footprint, that is the more trickier one and the one where most of our impacts lie. For us, it's really focused on our paper mills and our printers. So again, the energy, all the processes used to create our books, how we source and how we transport those materials, including others as well, like glues and inks, etc., where we just probably don't have that data, but that's something we really wanted to look into. Employee travel, so that means business travel, but also employee commuting, and then packaging and distribution travel and waste, etc. So as Liam mentioned, scope 3, there's a lot to do, but we really wanted to focus on like those key impact areas. So for us, we've been measuring it since 2014. So we feel like we've got a really good handle on where our impacts come as a business. And it might not be surprising to many of you, some of it might be, but for us, only 2% of our emissions actually lie within our scope 1 and 2. And the rest across those other 15 categories are in scope 3. And in particular, there's 4 areas where we can really see where we have the biggest impact. So there's paper mill, which is 42% of our emissions. There's printers, which is 31%. And then there's transport from the paper mill to the printer and then printer to our warehouse or to the customer, which is another 17%. So we know just from looking at that for us to make any difference in our carbon impact, we really have to tackle those areas. And you can see I've included a nice little chart on the right where you've got papers, printers, etc. And that makes up over 75% of our emissions, with just printers and papers alone making up nearly over 70% themselves. So just going back a little bit about how we got this data and how we captured this, because I do think it's really important. And as Liam said, a lot of people do get stuck on the data collection, especially for scope 3. And when you're relying on other people to provide you that data, especially when it's your supply chain, it can be really difficult. So for us, since 2020, we began really kind of accelerating this. So first, I mapped our supply chain. So it was all the printers that we had and all of the paper mills and paper brands that we had as well. So I really wanted us to have that transparency, because that is key when you're looking at your supply chain. Then I prioritized engagement. And again, as Liam said, this is absolutely important, is I focused on our top 15 to 20 suppliers, because that's where 80% of our business came from. So by engaging with them and talking to them about sustainability and carbon emissions, it allows you to kind of have that, you know, more insight and more influence in how to get them to reduce and get them to actually measure their impact as well. So after that, we built a carbon questionnaire based on things like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We worked with Bertelsmann, our parent company, to provide this, and that now sits with them. But we've been doing that for a few years. And I think that's really important, that we have a questionnaire which we can then send out to our printers and our paper mills to try and get them to gather the information themselves. From that, we created a supplier database to capture those responses. So we asked for our printers to fill in the questionnaire, and then we would record that. So then we could understand and kind of track their progress. Now, not everyone is focused on carbon emissions, and everyone will have different capabilities. So some suppliers would surprise us in measuring all of their scopes, and then some didn't measure any. So where they didn't measure any, we began to use proxy emissions. And that was through our own research, looking at country level emissions, but also kind of being able to compare the suppliers on that database. So if we knew that some suppliers were in the same country location, they had the same kind of size of unit, we could kind of cross-reference that. And it's really our own research. So this, you know, it's nothing super scientific, but it's how we feel like we can best incorporate all of our emissions as we further get down the line and our suppliers get more comfortable with answering this questionnaire. And lastly, we send out this questionnaire yearly, and we do question supplier data. So if someone is telling you they have a renewable energy certificate, we'd be keen to see that, just so we can document that and file that away, but also be sure that that is true to form. And same if they are using a lot of water or a lot of energy themselves, we would question that, kind of because we have that comparison to another supplier. So it really does help to have that transparency within your business. So this is an example, and hopefully you'll follow through with me. I'm hoping it's not too hard, but essentially this all comes to being able to measure an actual book's carbon impact. So once we've gathered all of that data from our printers and from our paper mills, we'll do the following. I do hope this helps, but we'll say, as an example, we have a paper mill in France, and they emit 667 kilograms of carbon per ton of paper used. We know then that we want to work with a printer in Italy who emits 253 kilograms of carbon per ton of paper used. Then we look at our transport from the paper mill to the printer. That's roughly around 500 kilometers, and that'll be an average, but that's by truck. And then we use national emission factors. So DEFRA for the UK, we know that it has an emissions impact of 0.13348. Then you have us as a publisher. So we have used 30 tons of paper by printing 50,000 books. And the way that we can monitor this is that we'll either collect the paper tonnage from our supplier, or our paper mill or printer, or we'll use the GSM of the paper, so the thickness of the paper. We'll measure that. We'll measure the extent of the book, so we know how many pages it is. In this case, it's 320, and we know what format the book is in. So for us, it's the standard B format, which is 198 millimeters by 129 millimeters. So if we use an example of that, we can then actually understand what the emissions are associated with that order. So the way that we do that for paper mills is we do the mill emissions times the paper tonnage divided by 1,000 to get tons. So it's 667 kilograms of carbon times 30 tons and divide by 1,000. So we know that paper mill or that paper will emit 20 tons. For the distance, for the travel from the paper mill to the printer, it's distance traveled times paper tonnage times the emissions factor, and again divided by 1,000, so we can get it in tons. So that's 500 kilometers times 30 times the emissions factor to get 2 tons. And then for printer emissions, we'll do printer emissions times paper tonnage and divide it by 1,000 again to get 7.69. So we can now see that if we have the book sitting in our printer, we can see that that order is just under 30 tons of carbon for those 50,000 books. So that's really important to us, so we can understand that. We'll also be able to see that from the offset, the paper is the biggest emitter here. So that's the one that we could really focus on to be able to reduce it. And then if we wanted to find out the emissions associated per book, what we do is we divide the total order of books, that 50,000, we divide that by the 29.79 tons of carbon emitted, and this time times it by 1,000 to get the kilograms. So we know that individual book will be 0.59 kilograms of carbon as a base. So how are we reducing based on what we know and all the data that we've gathered so far? So we've set up key meetings with suppliers to ask them to reduce their emissions, sign up to initiatives like the Science Based Target Initiative or CDP, and actually start setting them KPIs themselves. So we've asked our suppliers to reduce their energy or look at energy programs. And from that, when we started doing that a few years ago, 30% of our suppliers have either switched to part of renewable electricity, and then 70% have energy reduction initiatives in place. So that's really fantastic and something that we're seeing even in our own emissions as printer emissions continue to go down. We're in a place now from this year onwards where we're going to blacklist certain high carbon papers. We have all of that data, and because we've been gathering it for a while, we can understand what papers emit more than others. And we've reached out to those paper mills and have said until those emissions go down, we won't be placing any more work, just because as a responsible publisher, we want to be able to make sure that we're producing books that are low impact for us. We're also looking at alternative transportation. So specifically in Italy, we're looking at train transport, and we're going to be able to adopt that this year and pilot it, which is something we're very excited about, because trains are very much low emitting when it comes to the amount of cargo it can take, and also compared to truck, it's a lot less in terms of its carbon impact. Then last year, we released our sustainability toolkit, and it was a guide that really supports colleagues to make more sustainable choices. But it wasn't just sitting in one department. We wanted it to focus on design, editorial, and production, because our belief is that everybody has a role to play in this, and that design might not know that if they want, a thicker paper or a nicer type of paper, that's also going to impact the carbon impact. So we really wanted to bring everybody with us on this journey. And what's really exciting about this toolkit is that we are relaunching it again this year, and we're also going to make it external, so anybody would be able to access that toolkit. And I'm happy to share once that's live. And lastly, to do with the design for the future, but we also think this is important, is we are beginning to limit the materials and finishes on our books. So we've already moving away from glitter. We're looking to adopt more vegetable-based inks, and we're looking to limit the amount of lamination used on certain books as well. So we're beginning to really think about those materials that are used in our books and how they then impact everybody else further along the line. This led us to what we're calling our lowest carbon impact book. But really from the toolkit, we got in touch with the vintage team, so another division within Penguin Random House UK, and they were creating a series of vintage F books. They really wanted to produce them with sustainability in mind and wanted them to be as low carbon impact as possible. So we worked with them, and we used our lowest carbon mono, so black and white paper. They were produced locally in the UK, only using renewable energy. No lamination was used on the cover, so sealer was used instead. And then any residual emissions were then offset for carbon credits. And just to give you an example, An average Penguin UK book emits around 0.33 kilograms of carbon. Obviously, it can be a lot higher depending on if it's a cookbook or a children's book, if it's got lots of finishes and etc. But that's the average is 0.33, whereas this title only emitted 0.02 kilograms of carbon before then being offset. And we even worked with this team further to reduce the thickness of the paper after the first launch of it, which I think was really successful. So just a quick one before we finish the presentation and go to questions, but it was really about how you can measure and reduce your impact. And the key things that I'd say, which very much echo what Liam was saying, is do look at recognized carbon, accounting programs and initiatives, look at the greenhouse gas protocol. It's really important. Decide if you do want to do this in-house or work with others, but it really helps to have those in mind. For me, it was really mapping out our business operations and to determine those key impact areas, because that will really help you focus on where you want to drive your emissions and where you want to reduce. Next is find the key people within your organization that can help drive and deliver change. And yes, that's people in senior leadership, but also for me, it's really important that people throughout our company understand and engage with climate change. So I've been developing lots of work to do with people that are more junior in the business, because they're more active and they're actually probably more of those people that are going to push for things to stop in the company when there's people that have been there for a long time that might be used to it. So it's really finding the balance of that. For us, switching to renewable energy and investing in solar was a fantastic feat. And actually, as an example, when one of our suppliers switched to renewable energy in 2020, we saw emissions drop by 11% for that supplier. So it just shows you that even taking small steps, or what seem like small steps, actually really do have a huge impact. I also joined lots of external sustainability working groups, and I encourage others to do so as well. It really helps you to kind of put a finger on what everyone else is doing, but also collectively work in this area. I feel like sometimes sustainability, climate change, you can feel quite alone, but a lot of the time, everyone else is either in the same position or you can learn and engage with each other. I mean, for me, sustainability isn't a pre-competitive issue, and we should all be collectively working together to address it. And lastly, work with your suppliers and partners to see where they can reduce their impact. A lot of the time they might be working on initiatives and they might not be fully telling you, but they will get more comfortable with this. So the more comfortable that you are talking with your suppliers about this, the better the conversations are and the better the results will be. So I want to say thank you. And just a quick link that I've put to our social impact and sustainability page on Penguin, Random House UK. It has a detailed carbon impact report that we released a few months ago. So it gives you the exact figures of everything we've done. But thanks, I'll pass it back over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Courtney. And that's a really good hand in glove offering of what PRH UK has been doing. Fits very nicely with what Liam described in terms of an overall approach to the scope. A couple of questions that we've already received, and maybe I'll start with you, Courtney, but I would certainly love to hear Liam's perspective on this as well. Have you, in working with printers, the question specifically was, has there been any talk from printers about creating emission factors based upon the specs of the book that they're printing? It sounds like you kind of went down that road in part anyway. But was it printer led, or was it something that just to try and get some data on the table?
It's both. So we're working with one supplier in particular, one printer in the UK, who is actually doing a lot more work for us on particular specs. So we're looking at things like the carbon emissions associated with lamination versus varnish versus sealer, versus UV varnish as well, and everything used for that. So we're starting to get that data, but I will say it is really tricky, because a lot of the times printers will then have to go to their different manufacturers to get that information and to try and understand it. So I do see it becoming more and more kind of complete as a whole, and I do think a lot more working groups are actually looking at emission factors for certain specs, and I feel like you can get an average. So ink, I think, is like 4.23 kilograms of carbon per ton used, but that then is the same across vegetable versus mineral versus Pantone. So it's really hard to distinguish it because the data just isn't there, but I think in the next few years it will be there.
And Liam, from your perspective, because you're looking across multiple industries and use cases, is it common or at least a tried and tested approach to maybe create some averages to start and then fine tune as you go?
Definitely. And I mean, especially with scope 3, I mean, there's a few different approaches with many of the scope 3 categories that break down from, most accurate being using supplier specific factors, which is what Courtney has described in part, where a supplier has truly gone through the exercise of creating their own emission factors for their own output, for their own product. But that is, I would still say, a little bit on the rare side from an industry perspective. I mean, some materials, some groups, some industries and organizations are better at it than others. But most scope 3s, at least in introductory inventories, if you're looking at, paper or inks or even things like cardboard, you're naturally going to probably start with an industry average figure, or what's called an average based approach. So that's typically looking at, you may have some details that help modify that emission factor a little bit to make it, maybe account for recycled content. So you can lower it here and raise it there, depending on the supplier. But average is far more common than supplier specific. But I do think that will start to change, albeit quite slowly.
And Courtney, it sounds like you, when you talked about the example of having lower carbon footprint papers, you obviously were looking at suppliers and maybe even specific grades of or types of paper within suppliers.
Yeah, and just on that point, so some paper suppliers have really good data. So there's a few organizations like Seppi Tentos where they do the whole scope emissions, and so we found that some of our paper suppliers already had that involved. Some also use paper profiles, and then some printers also use Intergraph, which is another kind of initiative standard. So some will have that already, but it is, like Liam was saying, it's very much the few, but we are seeing it more and more each year that they're starting to sign up to these things.
Great, thanks. So that's helpful and hopefully responsive to the question that EJ asked. Adam was asking, he starts specifically with Courtney about the implications for ebooks or audiobooks, so non-print formats. Have you had a chance to study that? And do you have a point of view on it?
Yeah, so ebooks for us, because it's files, it very much depends on the data centers that you're using. So the main thing that we're looking at is looking at renewable energy for those data centers, and then to start tackling that this year going forward. Actually, most impact from an ebook will come from the device itself in terms of how it's made and how it's manufactured. There's lots of information and research online, which I found quite interesting. So I'll try and remember who it was, but there was something that was saying an ebook is like 16.5 kilograms of carbon and a book is 35 kilograms of carbon or something like that. So it was saying it was quite a lot higher than what we found it to be. So I think, again, data just isn't particularly there yet, but for us, it's more the data file itself, and then looking at how we store that and then how that's then sent across to other customers as well. And again, I think it's what we've said for both of those, because we both do ebooks and actual printed books, is we're trying to reduce both of them at the same time, but we probably recognize that ebooks are more sustainable in the sense of the types of, it won't contain inks or glues or actual paper, so it's kind of that balancing act, or those trade-offs that we have to talk about.
Great, thank you. And Liam, have you had experience in it's okay to say no, but because it's not a publishing specific, this is a publishing specific question, but with changes in delivery formats or the business model that somebody might be using, and so it kind of happens in real time and you have to track maybe two very different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think do you mean physical delivery of the books?
Well, in this case, it's just physical and digital kind of operating in parallel. The growth of digital has been, it's been relatively flat over the last several years, but audiobooks as a format is growing and it's increasingly streaming rather than physical product.
Yeah, I think Courtney's point on the data center aspect is certainly prudent. I think when you get into things like ebook devices, it gets a little bit confusing or tricky, because you you of course have the single file that is, hosted and shared somewhere, but then the device itself may have, 200 ebooks on it, may have 400 ebooks on it. They may not necessarily be read, once a year. So there's different, allocation methods that, you can kind of feed into the specific device that, frankly does get a little bit muddy. We have a number of clients that there's a scope 3 category called the use of sold products. So we work with a number of information technology groups that, that sell, internet routers and web-based products. And so you can look at what the carbon footprint of that device is actually going to be when it gets into the home of a customer. But for something like, a Kindle or something like that, that's not necessarily going to be within PRH's direct scope 3 boundary. It's just the file. So that would fall to the reporting category of the actual producer of that device. So again, a little bit muddy as far as scope 3 boundaries. It's, scope 3, when we talk about scope 3, it's not really the end of the world if two organizations report on the same scope 3. When you hear about double counting, you really don't want scope 1 and 2 to be reported within the same scope by two different companies. So, you could expand your scope and PRH could look at it, but it would naturally be by some very estimate-driven allocation method that might get a little bit tricky. And just quickly, as far as the actual physical delivery of books, I mean, we generally see one of two things happen. A number of Canadian, North American-based 3PL providers, large providers are getting pretty good at having, if you have a corporate account with a large delivery company, they'll often at least, provide their interpretation of what their carbon footprint was related to your leg of the journey from print to retail, whatever it may be. Usually within those files, it's pretty quick to determine, are they using their own fuel data? And this is like accurate and fleet specific, or are they using industry specific factors, of which there are a handful. Courtney mentioned DEFRA factors. Those are generally very well received in the European audience. EPA has their own in the States, and Canada has their own as well. But generally speaking, it's either provider specific, ideally with their own fuel data, or using industry less than truckload, full truckload type distribution factors.
Thank you. I can see, Courtney, why you're getting started on it this year. There are a lot of considerations.
Yeah, there's and as well, just for that, so when I joined in 2020, our scope keeps widening, which is fantastic, but also means more work. But I think you get a handle on certain things, and it's okay to stay with that for a while and then evolve. Like, we don't have to do everything at once. So it's really important for us that we get a handle on things like papers and printers and transport, and now start looking at things like digital data and actual material inks, and even for us like end covers of a book, which will be separate to the text paper. So these are all things that we're looking at.
I wanted to ask you, Courtney, you talked about things like finishes, and I was wondering if you were evaluating the finishes themselves on their carbon footprint or the impact on recyclability. So does a laminate, for example, is it negative in carbon footprint because it diminishes recyclability, or is it bad on its own, or challenging on its own, I guess?
Yeah, so the data isn't particularly there yet unless we're looking at averages. So we're working on that with our suppliers at the moment, or with one key supplier. We're looking at, can they give us emission data on what they would perceive it to be if lamination compared to the glue that they use and the inks. So we're looking at those three first. We're looking at it more from that life cycle analysis. So we're looking at its raw material impact, its manufacturing impact, and then its recyclability. The difficulty is that in the UK is when we do recycle it, because we have hundreds of councils, they might be able to recycle some and not all, and some could recycle that book, some might burn that book, and then some could go to landfill. So because we don't know every single council's ability, it's safer for us to assume that it would go to either landfill or potentially part be recycled, or whichever might be banned. So for us, we need to reduce that lamination, because we know that if it's stuck to the book, it's going to stop it being recycled by quite a few councils, and we want it to make it as easier for customers as we can.
And I know that the BIC sustainability effort, one of those party efforts that you recommended and that you're part of is looking at design for recyclability, and we'll be issuing something shortly, I think, if it hasn't already.
Yeah,
So
definitely. We'll be doing that, and he's done an amazing job. And I think it's also just trying to understand as what we're doing and what everyone can do, really.
yeah, and Liam, that probably is an approach you would endorse as well, which is to look at the life cycle rather than simply collecting data on suppliers on their own.
Yeah, I think that certainly makes sense. I mean, it's very easy to kind of look only at one element of the product and reduce at the front end and then realize, oh, this is going to have a massive impact on our waste generated in operations, and then a year or two later say, oh darn, look what happened. So life cycle thinking when it comes to products, I mean, even if you're not doing a full ISO standard life cycle analysis on everything that you bring into the shop, so to speak, having that life cycle lens is certainly never going to hurt your GHG program if you have a well built out list of scope 3s, for sure.
Just to confirm as well, like, I didn't use an ISO, it was just research test.
For sure. Yeah.
It's a lot of products, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be mindful of time, so I have one more other question. Maybe I'll start with you, Courtney, because it's asked specifically of PRH UK. But did the pandemic itself have a positive impact in terms of lower emissions due to things like less travel? And in the end, was it significant?
Yes, it did. It's very much changed our travel emissions as a business. So it used to be, our travel emissions used to be about 6% of our total impact, and it's now less than 2%. I think it might even be 1%. For 2021, I don't know what it's going to look like for 2022 because I'm in the middle of doing that data at the moment. I do know that our emissions will have increased this year, and I think that's because restrictions have gone down. But I think what's really important is we've been focused on a hybrid working model. So even coming into the office, that's probably once or twice a week. We're looking at electric vehicle chargers, we're looking at adopting greener taxis, and we're actually trying to work with our travel company on greener ways to sustainably travel for the business. And that's an area that I've seen increase just from an employee-led area. So actually employees coming to me to ask me how to travel to European book fairs as sustainably as possible. So I think that's one area where it's really helped. I think actually in the same year our books increased because everybody was staying home and reading books. So that's where we've had levels where we've increased in some areas and decreased in others. But we do want to take the lessons learned from the pandemic and really apply that into our business operations.
Liam, if I can give you the last word, that's probably a common theme that you heard over the last 2.5 years as well.
Yeah, and not to end it on a technical note, but I mean, it's also done very interesting things in the world of target setting, because what happened in 2020 and 2021 is in a lot of ways travel emissions. If you're a professional services company, if you're a group, a multinational that has to travel for various reasons and your emissions go way, way, way down, you have this, what I'd say artificially deflated baseline, where if you then set a target using that as anything, emissions are going to start to creep back up in that category, which basically means that you've set a target and you're already essentially going to have a pretty punitive situation as COVID restrictions start to lift and travel goes up. So a lot of our work has been to either advise our clients that this is a risk for you from a target setting perspective, or to frankly do multiple inventories at once. So if we have a new engagement, it's not just about looking at 2021 last year, because it was the most recently completed year in 2022 that we had available, but it was going back to 2019 and deciding, does it make more sense to set a target on 2019, provided the business hasn't changed very much. And a lot of companies will surely take that route because the impacts were huge for some companies. We have a client who had something like 3,400, 3,600 tons of emissions in 2019, and it fell to 300-400 tons in 2020 or 2020 to 2021. It just fell off a cliff, right? So there's lots of considerations on the technical side, but target setting and choosing the right baseline in relation to how COVID affected your business is certainly going to be very important to any group here.
Well, thank you for that. And it's not surprising that it's complicated. You've given a good explanation of both how it's complex, but also how we can tackle it both generally and specifically in book publishing. Courtney, Liam, thank you for making the time today. Thank you for being part of this conversation and for leading the way and when it comes to understanding our carbon footprint.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Brian.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.